I think the theme, general thematic of Civilution, challenges us because it speaks in many ways to the profession, how it thinks, what it's learnt, and perhaps the hardest thing in any profession is how we unlearn bad things and relearn new things, especially as we grow a little bit older. How do we unlearn bad things and learn new things? And the problem is not confined to this profession. I think it's a general issue, and so if for no other reason than to ask a series of questions about what we learn and how we learn, the thematic of Civilution is one that we must encourage. In the past 5 years, I'm actually still chair of the National Planning Commission. I don't know for how long, but there you go. I've had to go through some of this myself because to some extent for 13 years prior I was pigeonholed as the Minister of Finance thinking about matters financial. And when the President asked me to take responsibility for the National Planning Commission, I found myself working with a commission made up of diverse individuals bringing various skills to the table. Some of them obviously engineers, some of them are here this morning. You can't avoid these people even if you try. And I had to kind of get out of this pigeonhole of the Minister of Finance, and it was in many ways an interesting challenge, because I think that part of our learning is to push up against the boundaries that try and confine us. And in the course of this period, I've also had the privilege of serving on commissions that are rather interesting. One of those I serve on at the moment, in fact, I co-chair, is a Global Ocean Commission. Now, how, you may ask, does somebody like me end up on a global commission dealing with the ocean? But we leave that for another day. The Global Ocean Commission is working to finalization, and there are a series of issues that we're trying to draw together as we close and think about drafting the report. And the first of these is, of course, the place of the ocean in our lives as the filter for oxygen, and therefore the interconnectedness between the issues of planetary climate change and the ocean system. The issue of high seas governance, because the high seas is truly a global commons, but there's no government outside of the exclusive economic zone. There's no governance. And if there's no governance, questions of accountability arise, and in the absence of governance, the capacity of certain countries to overfish, and the temptation to do this means hardship for people in coastal communities. There's also the issue of plastics in the ocean. You know, right now, the world produces about 300 million tons of plastic a year, and roughly a third of this ends up in the ocean. I'm raising this not because I want to talk about oceans this morning to people who want to talk about how to dig up land for roads and this, that, and the other, but to merely draw attention to the fact that so much of what we do is linked. But yet part of the challenge is to unlearn that which confines and separates us and relearn the way in which things are connected. Now, if you want to know how things are connected and you think about the 100 million tons of plastic in the ocean, just pause for a moment and reflect on the many satellite pictures we've seen as the world searches still for that Boeing 777 MH370. And just reflect on the amount of plastic and other flotsam we've seen in the deep ocean. And then you begin to add not just the large islands of plastic that float about, but the microscopic particles. And then think again about how we produce what we produce and ask about the paradigms that we follow in decision making. I'm saying that the consequences of engineering are pretty far-reaching, and when SAICE brings together a new approach to thinking about these issues as Civilution offers, it compels engineers to think about the consequences of decisions that they take. Now, much of the infrastructure in the world is mega. This has been the world. If you look at land transportation, look at large countries, it was always built for larger engines emitting CO2 at the rate of knots. The more lanes, the larger the vehicles, the happier the engineers. But it's never been confined only to land transportation. If you pause and reflect also on the port's infrastructure and the way in which we as Africans have never quite been able to capture what our forebears did much better. Our forebears were able to move down the east coast of Africa, Indian Ocean in dhows, stop off, trade, engage. If you go to Mapungubwe, you'll find that there are remnants of trade between Africa and Asia that are exceedingly dated. But we don't think like that. We have never quite developed a maritime system as part of our thinking about ports in Africa, about how to trade and about how to reconnect, because we prefer road and in fact rail, which is the tragedy of our times. The shame that every African civil engineer should feel when we look at the mirror is that the last big rail systems in Africa were built about 100 years ago. It's a gift of British colonialism and Cecil John Rhodes, Cape to Cairo. And we haven't even maintained those systems. If we think of energy and we think of energy production, we think of the grids that support energy, much of what we're talking about belongs to a somewhat different generation. The new stuff in telecoms is still largely underdeveloped. We have wonderful cables landing on the African continent, but in the main still underdeveloped. And if we look at the big challenges of waste and water systems, I think that the world must begin to unlock our minds as African engineers, how we relate to our environment, how we provide services on an ongoing basis. There's a very terrible screen here. It says class will resume in 30 minutes and now 28 seconds. So for the next period when you're listening to me, you're not learning anything. That's what it says. So class will only resume when I end. Now, part of the challenge, I think, is that much of what engineers are involved in is done on commission. The points raised about governments largely commission work and engineers respond to what is commissioned. I'm not quite sure why engineers would want to go into politics. Have you no ambition? But much of the commissioning of engineering on the continent and elsewhere was done at a time when sustainability appeared not to matter as much as it does today. So engineers, when asked to design. When asked to build. When asked to supervise construction, do so. Don't ask the questions about CO2 emissions. Don't ask the questions about where tomorrow's water will come from. And so part of, I think, what Civilution offers is a necessary opportunity to engage outside of the discipline, outside of the pigeonhole, and ask in an interdisciplinary way what needs to be done to build a different future for our people. And if you unpack the situation in our country, start with energy. Much of our industrial base was built on the idea that we had tons of cheap, high sulfur, high ash content coal. And we could utilize this coal to produce electricity. In fact, we didn't just have to use it for ourselves, we could even add value to Australian bauxite by building aluminium smelting plants. We could export this cheap coal, and nobody would mind the fact that we were emitting CO2, making us one of the highest emitters per unit of GDP. And we claimed that this was low cost, and we built an entire industrial base on the fact that we had low cost energy as a competitive advantage. But the world has shifted. And in shifting, some of the battles, I think, find resonance in the everyday discussions, be this around dinner tables or board tables. What happens to the price of electricity? How do we provide for the next power station and the one thereafter? The fact that the world is moving along a path of bringing more renewables into play in the energy debate, yet we are behind the curve because it's exceedingly difficult at our energy price to bring independent power producers into play. Must speak to the way in which decisions are taken and how change is effected. It must also speak to the way in which we learn and unlearn, and we challenge ourselves in a range of areas. So part of what we're living through is that there's this huge paradigm shift in energy, and we are playing catch up, and we're not very good at it because now we're a bit tired, old, and unfit, and we can't run as fast as those who are getting ahead of the curve. In many ways, that speaks to the challenges of what we've become. So what the National Development Plan does in this context is not to speak to the present, it speaks to the future. And part of what the plan does, and you don't have to carry the plan around with you because you can download the plan as an app and use it. The entire plan is available as an app, and if you want a demonstration, we can do that this morning. Because not you engineers, but I find too frequently people arrive with their iPads under the arm and you say, do you know what's in there? And they say, no, I use it for emails, that's all. So my invitation to you is to download the app. It's NDP 2030, all of the chapters, and go through it, and I'll say something about that in a moment. Part of what we did as the Planning Commission was to invite people who have different skills. Because, you know, amongst the commissioners, not me, but amongst the commissioners, you know, are people like Mike Muller. I'm sure that a number of engineers here know Mike, and Tandabantu Goba. Now, these are engineers, and the only skills they've got are empirical skills, and it's all based on yesterday. Right? Engineers tend to be like that, no? No? Yes. Yes. All of us are like that. And so the vision part of the National Development Plan is largely about that. What it speaks to is what we ought to be capable of. And so you do that before you kind of deal with the nitty-gritty of where you need to get to. But if you know what you're capable of, then you are also capable of asking a series of tough questions of yourself about the quality of life of people and what you must do and how you align decisions. For people who still read newspapers, there was a wonderful piece yesterday in the City Press, co-authored by three of our commissioners, Mike Muller, Zanele Gaza, and Carl van Holt. And part of what they're asking is a question that we asked repeatedly in the National Development Plan. What are the elements of a decent standard of living. Ask any South African, what are the elements of a decent standard of living? A large part of it actually coincides with issues of the built environment. Access to housing, water, sanitation, and electricity. Access to safe, reliable, and affordable public transport. Access to education and skills. Access to safety and security where we find ourselves. Access to decent, affordable health care. Access to employment. Access to recreation and leisure. A clean environment and nutrition. All of these are elements of a decent standard of living. And if we recognize that that is important and we recognize that that is in the spirit of our Constitution, I think part of what Civilution must offer engineers to think about is how we get there and how we are able to contribute to the provision of that decent standard of living for all of our people. And as we engage with those tough issues, we're also constructing a confluence between economic infrastructure, social infrastructure, a re-engineered built environment, and a series of social services that sometimes are enabled by good quality engineering. It also means, of course, that our economy must be much more inclusive. And as we think of an inclusive economy, one of the first issues that arises is employment and youth and skills and sustainability. And we also recognize that the National Development Plan is actually of all of society, not of government. Now that's an interesting challenge. It's an interesting challenge certainly because I made the point earlier that so much of the engineering that has taken place across world history has been commissioned. And part of what we need to think about is how engineers are involved in the process differently. If it's not just government, but all of society, then the skills that the engineering profession must bring into play must resonate quite differently and at a different point in the decision-making continuum. Now, Martin made a rather disparaging point about people with gray hair. I can't join in that discussion. I don't have hair, but that's a different issue. You see, there's a rather interesting debate about how we value skills and the contribution of experience in society. And sometimes the press doesn't inform us very well. There was an article in one of the newspapers yesterday about the large percentage of university professors who are approaching the age of 65, which is the cutoff age, and then they must go out to graze somewhere. But I know, because I'd lobbied for this because of my own position approaching that kind of twilight of life. And last year, the Minister of Higher Education and Training, Dr. Nzimande, announced after due consideration that professors shouldn't have to leave at 65. In fact, he'd like to see a cutoff age of 80. Because the idea that at 65, or now in South Africa, 63, people are old and must be put out to graze, surely should not find resonance. So the way in which we value and ensure that we can replicate skills is fundamentally important. You see, in the National Development Plan, we speak of a massive acceleration in university education. Part of our problem in the higher education sector is that there are too few people doing work after their bachelor's degree. And so there's a huge gap coming down the track, partly because once people have a degree, they can leave university and make lots of money in a very short space of time. So we aren't generating sufficient people who will remain in academia. And if at the same time there's this idea that at the age of 65, people must be put out of universities, we can see and we must anticipate a huge risk. Rather, we need to use the skills that we have to ensure continuity and replication. And that must apply in academia, but it must also apply in disciplines like engineering. I was speaking to a civil engineer the other day who was involved in the project side of the profession now, and he was reflecting on a rather interesting point. He's 63 and so is reaching pensionable age, and he says, I'm working with an amazing group of young people. They come through and they're well trained, and they can do the math, and they can read plans and see issues and be involved up to the point where there's a problem, and then they search around for the gray hair to find the people who've lived through similar problems before. And ensuring that that applies across the entire spectrum of the profession is something that we must value, recognize as important, and understand that it's part of the impetus for transformation going forward. And so, as I invite this gathering of engineering professionals to look at the National Development Plan, I want to ask that you avoid the frequent myopia. Part of what we did when we drafted the plan was to do things as we tend to do, because we're still informed by the past. We break things down into chapters. Now, I know that engineers tend to go for chapter 4. They don't read the first chapters, and they don't read anything. If they've read chapter 4, which deals with economic infrastructure, they think that they understand the plan. It's not a bad idea, but it's actually a lousy idea, because it doesn't allow you to understand that there has to be a connection between chapter 3, which deals with the economy in broad, chapter 5, which deals with sustainable development, chapter 6, which deals with inclusive rural infrastructure, chapter 9, which deals with education, skills, and innovation. You've actually got to take account of all of these issues. Or indeed, chapter 8, which presents a particular set of challenges because it deals with the national space economy and urban infrastructure. And so my pleading as you deal with this is not to pigeonhole yourselves into understanding chapter 4 and being able to recite it at dinner at home tonight. What we'd like to do is to encourage the thinking about all of these issues, because one of the advantages that the National Development Plan offers us is to think across the lines, across the silos, and to think about the South Africa that we want to create. Part of what we need to focus on, and I hope that it's the hard debates of the first 5 years, is to engage with what we call a capability upgrade. And part of dealing with this is to ensure that we avoid the debt traps. And if we want to avoid the debt traps, then we need to look at what we have collectively owned, which includes our mineral wealth, how we mine, how we value, how we price, how much we extract at what point, and how we utilize the proceeds of that to pay for this capabilities upgrade. It challenges us in a very direct way. We've lived through these challenges. Part of what happened under apartheid and before was that the owner of the surface rights owned the mineral rights, and so all you needed to do was to chase indigenous people off the land, took control of surface rights, and then you controlled the mineral rights. That was what the 1913 and 1936 Land Acts were about. We changed that with the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, where we took all mineral rights and placed it in the hands of the state, acting on behalf of the people as a whole. So the rights belong to all of us collectively. How we use it, how we extract wealth, and how we use it to pay for the capabilities upgrade, which has to include very significantly an infrastructure upgrade, is part of the challenge that we must be able to speak to. And the National Development Plan invites us into this discussion because at one level the NDP is a pretty high-level plan. It needs the detail, it needs the minds of engineers to be able to bring it down, to drill down, and help us provide a granularity that will make for the success and allow for different projects within the plan to be detailed and planned for. Now, it's a very important challenge. It's a challenge that we think about in a variety of different ways, because one of the things about us as South Africans is that we, to some extent, are resting on our laurels. We're an amazing country. You look at engineering and you look at the successes of what we've been able to do. How many times have we had guests from anywhere else in the world and they say, what an amazing infrastructure endowment you have. Look at the quality of your roads. They would take the Gautrain and say, wow, this is fantastic. They would come through the airport and say, how amazing all of this is. You can look at other parts of engineering where we've made big breakthroughs. Take the heavy haulage rail, Sishen, Saldanha, or Ermelo, Richards Bay, unprecedented in the world. Take the design of Dolos for the construction of harbor walls. None of it, of course, had intellectual property rights registered on them. But they speak to the capability of a nation that wants to drive change. But actually, both of those were almost 50 years ago now. Dolos and heavy rail, designed almost 50 years ago. Where is our innovation of the moment is the challenge to the engineering profession right now. You see, in some ways we think of ourselves as being great because we had great leaders and a great constitution and a great set of moments about how we drove the change. In this country, we didn't need the United Nations to supervise what we were doing. We didn't need Lancaster House. In fact, our constitution was negotiated in this building. Part of our senselessness is we've allowed that building to become a casino. How useless we are. And so rethinking and re-energizing ourselves is fundamentally part of it. You know, this morning some South Africans are feeling very bad. Nigeria rebased the economy and now have an economy that is substantially larger than ours, and so suddenly we don't feel so special. Actually, we've known this stuff about Nigeria for a long time. The only problem is that they should have rebased as regularly as the rest of us do. And then we would have seen that what I think their government is facing a challenge with is what is the size of their deficit. Surely it's too small for a GDP as large as theirs. What is their per capita spending on education? All of these things, I think, are going to challenge them very differently now. So, you know, let's not get too het up about the fact that the Nigerian GDP is a bit larger than ours as of this morning, formally. We need to rethink who we are and what we do. There's an author, Duncan Green, who's written a book about the empowerment of people, and he says that when a government and people struggle together, they own the victories differently. One of the reasons why our constitution is so important to us is that we own that constitution as our own. I said that Mike Muller and two other commissioners published this piece in the city press yesterday. And part of what they're calling for is for a compact, calling on government, civil society, business organizations, professional organizations to rethink what we do. Not so long ago, Ketso Gordon made a call for the industry, government, private sector to come together to look at infrastructure needs of the future. Let's stop taking ad hoc decisions. Let's try and join these things together. Let's begin to think in the longer term about who we are and where we want to be. And these ideas are exceedingly poignant now. We cannot have the separation and the breakdown that we're seeing, for instance, in the platinum industry. We need to start thinking about our future together. And part of what Civilution offers is an opportunity to do thinking like that. But it also means that we have to rethink a whole range of issues. We need to rethink regulation, funding, and ensure the security of things like energy supply. We must rethink these issues. We can't have what we're living through, which is still a low-priced energy, hard to transcend from where we are, but then face the reality of power outages. How do we get there? What are the skills that we need to get there? Part of what we have as this great nation is an underdevelopment in certain skill sets. When there's a shutdown at any of our refineries, and part of the problem at construction like Medupi is that we still need coated pipe welders from Korea or Thailand. How do we begin to change that, and how does a discussion that you want to undertake in Civilution compel us to think about these issues differently? How do we revisit issues like rail for mass transport? I mean, there are interesting debates in rail. Some people who are more attached to European standards say that we can't run rail more frequently on the Cape gauge that we use. Japan uses the Cape gauge, and in cities like Tokyo, they run trains every 45 seconds. Now, if you rethink this, your mind must take you to getting out of the traffic jams. You don't even have to bother too much about e-tolls if you live in this province. But rethink it we must, and I think we would look to this profession to rethink how we are able to deal with some of these issues. I want to say that the engineering profession is invited into a very different discourse from what we've had. Tough questions about what infrastructure, how we prioritize infrastructure, how it's costed, and how it's innovated become important. We need to ask questions about how we change, what gets changed, and how we modernize everything that we do, but never letting go of that which brought us to this point. And then there are some very tough issues that require critical appraisal. My sense is that the engineering profession, the SAICI profession, has let go of the very need to oversee construction. I can't for a moment believe why roads that are sealed in a few months break up. Where was the resident engineer? Should we not bring back some kind of pillaring or capital punishment for REs who don't do what they must? Or is it just that the world right now is facing too big a demand for asphalt, and the price of petroleum is too high, and so nobody cares about quality anymore? Do we just wash our hands and walk away from the responsibility of ensuring the sustainability of what we do? What is the role of the industry, the profession? If the only challenge that this profession responds to is the retention of its integrity, then we have gone a long, long way. Traditionally, the role of the state has been the procurer of services, the arbiter of interests, the provider of long-term thinking. But it can only succeed if this industry, this profession, is strong, modern, engaged, and unselfish in its thinking. I think that the big idea of Civilution is a wonderful idea. It needs to be advanced, and people within this profession are best placed to advance this discussion with vigor. So I wish you well in the discussions here, but I want to plead that they don't end when you leave this venue. It must be internalized, it must be owned, and it must reshape the way in which this profession engages every day with what it does and how it takes initiative to ensure that the big ideas of the National Development Plan are not the ideas of the Planning Commission or of government, but they're owned collectively by all of us. The sign says, time's up. Thank you very much.